The key hung on a ribbon beneath her collar, warm from her own skin, and in 20 years Miss Adelaide Verlon had let no other hand touch it. On the last grey morning of October, in the long gallery of Marchholt Court, she stood before the door at the foot of the West Tower, and pressed her palm flat against the wood, as she did every dawn. And she listened, and she heard nothing. And she was glad. The house behind her was waking. Below, in the kitchen passage, a pot rang against iron. Somewhere, a maid dropped a shutter latch and swore under her breath, in the way maids did when they believed no gentlewoman near. Adelaide did not turn. She had learned to hold a stillness the way other women held their breath, and she held it now against the cold stone and the closed door and the thing beyond it that only she remembered. She was 41 years old, and the season had long since decided what she was. To Marchholt, she was the governess, who had outlasted 3 generations of the family she served, a spare gray figure at the edge of every christening and every funeral, a woman without people of her own. To the village she was stranger still, the one who kept the tower shut, who would not answer when asked why, who would turn the question aside, so many times that the asking had curdled into a story. They said she had buried something up there. They said she had lost her wits in the year of the great fever. They said in the low voice reserved for such things that she was mad, that gentle poor thing, mad and faithful and past all mending. You have, perhaps, known a house like this one, where a locked door becomes a kind of scripture, read differently by everyone and understood by no one. Stay with me. The truth of that door is gentler and harder than the village guessed, and it had waited 20 years for the one man who could bear to hear it. He came at the end of that same week, in the rain, unannounced. The new master of Marchholt Court. Adelaide heard the carriage on the gravel before any servant did, for she had spent 2 decades listening for the sound of things arriving. And she went to the tall window on the stair and watched a man step down into the wet, without waiting for the step to be set. He was tall, and moved as though he had learned to move under weight, dark hair, plastered now by the rain to a strong brow. A traveling coat of good dark wool gone black at the shoulders with water. He did not look up at the house the way heirs looked up, at houses they meant to enjoy. He looked at it the way a man looks at a debt he has come at last to pay. His name was Nathaniel Ashworth, and he was the Earl of Marchholt now, though the title had reached him by a road no one had wished. His uncle, the old Earl, had died in the spring without a living son. Nathaniel had been a soldier, then a younger man of no particular expectation. Then, by 3 deaths in 4 years, the last of his line. He had not seen this house since he was a boy of 10. He had not, Adelaide would learn, wanted to see it ever again. She met him in the hall with the household ranged behind her. The butler, Mr. Coombe Gray and correct. The housekeeper. Pale with her hands folded the maids in a nervous line. Adelaide curtsied the exact depth the moment required, and no deeper. When she rose, she found the new Earl looking at her, and not past her, and something in the directness of it made the old key lie cold against her breastbone. "You are the governess," he said. His voice was low and level, a voice that did not trouble to fill a room because it expected the room to attend. "There are no children here." "There are not. My lord, I keep the house's memory instead." She had not meant to say it. It had come out of her the way water finds the one crack in a wall. He held her gaze a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he passed on into his house, and the household exhaled, and Adelaide stood with her heart going hard in her throat. For no reason. She would name. That night, she did what she had done 10,000 nights. She climbed to the door at the foot of the tower, after the house had gone dark, and she unlocked it, and she went up the narrow, curving stair with a single candle, and she sat for 1 hour in the round, cold room at the top, where the rain came sideways against old glass, and she kept her vigil, and she told no one, and she came down and locked the door and went to her narrow bed. What she guarded was not treasure, and not a corpse, and not a mad woman's hoard. It was smaller than any of those, and heavier than all of them. That reckoning was not yet ready to be made, and she was practiced at not making it. The Earl did not settle into Marchholt the way a man settles into comfort. He rose before the maids had the grates cleared, and walked the grounds in the wet without a hat, out past the walled garden and the dead beds and the frost-blackened yews. And he came back with his boots ruined, and his face no easier than when he had gone. He went through the estate books in the late library with a single branch of candles and a face like carved stone. Mrs. Carey, Pell reported, scandalized and admiring at once, that he had asked her not for the best wine, but for the coldest room, because he did not sleep, and did not wish to keep a fire burning for a man who would not use it. Adelaide brought the household its orders each morning as she had for 20 years, and each morning she found the new Earl already at the long table, with the ledgers open and a cup of coffee gone cold at his elbow, untouched. He asked her questions no former master had troubled to ask. Which tenant on the Low Farms had lost a wife that year? Whether the roof of the almshouse at the village edge had been mended before the wet came? What the old Earl had promised the widow Hartnell about her son's schooling, and whether the promise had been kept. Adelaide answered him, and answered again, and slowly understood that this was a man who did not mean to enjoy Marchholt at all, only to discharge it the way a soldier discharges a duty he did not choose and will not shirk. She found to her own unease that she respected it. Respect was a thing she had learned to withhold from men of rank, for it had rarely been returned. She could not seem to withhold it from him. Adelaide watched him without appearing to. It was a skill of hers, honed across 2 decades of standing at the edge of rooms she was not meant to be seen in. And she saw what the household in its relief did not yet see, that the new Earl carried something the way she carried something, folded away and locked and never spoken. She saw it in the way his hand went, once, unthinking, to the breast of his coat when he passed a certain portrait in the gallery, an old portrait of a young woman with his own dark eyes. She saw it in the way he would stop in a doorway before entering a room, as though checking it were safe to be seen. There was a small parlor off the east passage that he would not enter at all. He would pause at its threshold, look once into the shadowed room where a child's rocking horse still stood under a dust sheet, and go another way round the house rather than cross it. And he did this every time, and he did it as though he did not know he did it. Adelaide recognized the posture. She had worn it herself for 20 years. A person who avoids a room that carefully is not indifferent to it. A person who avoids a room that carefully is guarding a wound the room can open. The first time he asked her about the tower, it was 3 days after his arrival, and he asked it plainly, over the estate accounts she had been called to explain. There is a room in the West Tower, marked in the old steward's ledger, as closed and struck from the rents, he said. No fire laid, no window cleaned, no entry made in 20 years. Coombe tells me the governess holds the only key and will not give it up. He set down his pen. Why is it locked, Miss Furlong? The question had been put to her by 100 mouths across 20 years, and she had turned every one aside. She turned this one too. It is not a room fit for use, my lord. There is nothing in it of any value to the estate. That is not what I asked. His eyes did not leave her face. I asked why it is locked. Because I lock it. She met his gaze and held it, and she felt the old cold key against her breastbone, and for one terrible instant she wanted to tell him. This stranger, this soldier with the wound in him she could see, and he did not know she saw. The wanting frightened her more than the question. Forgive me, my lord. It is the one thing in this house that is mine. I ask that it remain so. She expected him to command her. Men in his position commanded. Instead, he looked at her a long moment, and something moved behind the stone of his face, and he said, in a voice gone strangely quiet, You need not fear me taking it. I have kept a locked door of my own. And he returned to the accounts and did not raise the matter again for many days. That was the first deposit. She did not know to call it that. Her body, though, knew something. Her mind refused, For that night, when she kept her vigil in the round, cold room, she found her thoughts had gone to him, to the quiet in his voice, to the sentence he had not finished, and she had to steady herself against the sill until the treacherous warmth in her chest went out. Understand what her wound was, because the house had misremembered it into a ghost story. And the truth is, plainer and worse. 20 years before, Adelaide had come to Marchholt as a young woman of 21 to be governess to the old Earl's granddaughter, a bright, grave child named Clara. She had loved that child as her own, more than her own, for Adelaide had no others and would have none. In the round room at the top of the west tower, Clara had kept her lessons and her small treasures. Her first watercolors, a wooden horse, a book of pressed flowers she had gathered herself. And in the winter of the great fever, at 7 years old, Clara had died in that room, in Adelaide's arms, over a single long night, while the rain came sideways against the glass. The family had grieved, and then, as families of that rank did, had closed the grief and moved the surviving heirs to the London house and let the tower fall out of use. Adelaide had asked one thing of the old Earl, and he, softened by his own loss, had granted it. She asked to keep the key. She had kept it since. She kept the room exactly as the child had left it, the watercolors, the wooden horse, the book of pressed flowers. She dusted them with her own hands and let no other hand touch them, because she was the last living person who remembered that a girl named Clara had ever laughed on that stair. And when Adelaide let the room be opened and cleared, Clara would be gone a second time, and forever, and there would be no one left in the world to grieve her. That was what she guarded. Not treasure, a child. No one else remembered. The days shortened toward winter. The Earl remained, against every expectation of a man who had not wanted the house, and slowly the shape of his own locked door began to show itself to Adelaide, though he never spoke of it directly. She learned from Mrs. Medderbley. Pell, who had it from the Earl's own man, the truth Nathaniel carried. He had been a captain in Spain. He had, on a road near a burning town, given an order he believed correct, an order to hold a position rather than fall back. And the position had been overrun, and the men who died holding it had included his own younger brother, Edmund, who had ridden to warn him and arrived too late to do anything but die beside him. Nathaniel had come home, the head of a family he had helped to end. He wore no black now, for the year was past, but he carried Edmund's miniature in the breast of his coat, the small painted oval his hand went to without his knowing, and he could not enter certain rooms of this house because Edmund had played in them as a boy, and the sight of them was a hand around his throat. So there were 2 of them in that great house, each keeping a locked room, each guarding a child of memory, and neither yet knowing the other did the same. The turn came on a gray afternoon in November, and it came because of a servant's boy. There was a child in the household after all, a scullery lad of 8 named Tom, orphaned son of a laundress, kept on out of charity, and given the run of the yards. Tom was a climber, a wanderer, a boy who could not see a locked door without wondering at it, and on that afternoon, while the household was at its dinner below, Tom found the door at the foot of the west tower, standing an inch open, for Adelaide called suddenly away by Mrs. Pratt. Pell had failed for the first time in 20 years. To lock it behind her, she came back to find the door open, and her heart stopped in her chest. She went up the stair faster than her 41 years should have allowed. And in the round, cold room, she found the boy, not breaking, not stealing, but standing very still before the small wooden horse on the sill, holding it in both hands with a care she had not taught him and could not have expected, and turning to her with wide, frightened eyes. "I didn't hurt it, miss," Tom said. "I only wanted to see, whose was it?" And Adelaide, who had turned aside 100 questions across 20 years, who had built her whole survival on the turning aside, looked at the frightened, careful boy holding Clara's horse in the gray light, and something in her that had been held shut for 2 decades came quietly open. Her name was Clara, she said. It was the first time she had spoken it aloud in that room since the night the child died. She was 7 years old. This was her horse. She named him Marchpane for the sweet, and she rode him on this sill across whole countries she invented. The boy listened, the way children listen, with his whole self. And when Adelaide had finished, he set the horse down on the sill exactly where it had stood, exactly, and he said, "I'll not tell, miss. You oughtn't be sat up here on your own, though." She did not know that the Earl stood at the foot of the tower stair. She did not know he had come looking for Tom, whom Mrs. Pell had sent for, and had found the door open and climbed the stair, and stopped 3 steps below the round room. When he heard a woman's voice speak a dead child's name, he did not enter. He stood in the dark of the stair, and he listened to Adelaide tell an orphan boy about a girl named Clara, and a wooden horse named Marchpane, and he pressed his own hand to the miniature in his coat, and something in the stone of him cracked clean through, silently, where no one could see. He said nothing that day. He went down before she could know he had come. That was the witnessing. And after it, he was a changed man toward her, in ways so small the household did not mark them, and Adelaide marked every one. He began to find reasons to be where she was. He asked her to walk the gallery with him, and name the portraits, the whole grave line of Marchholt dead, the earls and their countesses and the children who had not lived to be either, and he listened to her name them as though the names mattered. She had thought herself the only living creature who knew that the second portrait from the window was not the third Earl's wife at all, but his sister, dead of a fall from a horse at 20, painted after death from a miniature, so that the family might have her on the wall. She told him so. He stood a long while before the painted dead girl, and then he said low, "It is a hard thing to be remembered only on a wall," and Adelaide, who had spent 20 years refusing to let a child be remembered only on a wall, felt the sentence go into her like a key into a lock. When the November cold came into the house, he sent word by Mrs. Pell that the governess's room, the coldest in the north passage, was to have a fire laid morning and night. Adelaide had gone 20 years in that room without a fire. She had told herself she did not feel the cold, and had half believed it, when she came stiffly to the library to thank him for a kindness she did not know how to receive. He cut her off before she had finished the first sentence. "Sit closer to it," he said, not looking up from the ledger. "You have kept a cold vigil long enough." And though it was framed as an order, and she received it stiff-backed as an order, she understood dimly, and against her will, that it was not an order at all, but a hand held out, and her body understood it faster than her mind, for she felt the warmth climb her throat and had to look away from him into the fire. She had been cold so long that being warmed felt almost like a grief. The way a numbed hand aches when the blood comes back into it, she told herself it was nothing. She told herself a man of his rank and his age might be kind to an old servant out of a soldier's rough courtesy and mean nothing by it. She was 41 and gray, and the season had decided long ago what she was. No man crossed a room for such a woman. She had made her peace with that at 30, and remade it every year since, and she would not now unmake it for the sake of a fire laid and a quiet voice, however the voice moved through her when she was not guarding herself. She had not reckoned, though, on his own wound, answering hers. It answered on a night, near the end of the month, when a storm came up out of the west, and rattled the whole house, and Adelaide, keeping her vigil in the round room, heard a step on the stair below. She rose. She had never in 20 years been found there. The candle shook in her hand as the Earl came up into the round room, ducking his dark head under the low arch, the storm loud at the old glass, and stood looking at the small watercolors and the wooden horse and the book of pressed flowers, at the whole small country of a dead child kept 20 years against forgetting. "I know now what you keep," he said quietly. "Coombe told me the child's name. Clara. Your charge." "She died here." "She died here," Adelaide said. "There was no turning it aside now. In this room, in my arms. And when I let this room be opened and cleared, she will be gone from the world entire, because I am the last who remembers. She was ever in it. So I do not let it be opened. That is the whole of my madness, my lord. It is only love that has nowhere left to go." The storm filled the silence. And then Nathaniel Ashworth, Earl of Marchholt, a man who did not speak of his wound to any living soul, drew from the breast of his coat the small painted oval he carried, and he held it out to her in the candlelight, and his level voice was not quite level. "My brother," he said, "Edmund, he died holding a road I told him to hold. I carry him because I am the last who remembers the boy. He was before the soldier. I have thought myself alone in this house, with a dead child in my coat." He looked at her, and the stone was all gone from his face now, and what was under it was grief, and something warmer than grief. "I find I am not alone." They stood very close in the small round room with the storm, at the glass, the two small relics of two remembered children between them, and Adelaide felt her whole careful 20 years shift on their foundation. His hand had not touched hers. It might have. It hovered near hers, where they both held the sill, near enough that she felt the warmth of it, and neither of them closed the last inch, because closing it would make it real, and neither yet dared. She looked up at his face in the candlelight and found him looking down at hers. Not past it, never past it, and the wanting in her was so sudden and so total that she had to name it to herself in plain words. There in the round room at 41 years old, she wanted this man, wanted his nearness and his voice and the grief they shared. Wanted it with a body she had thought long past all wanting. "You should not be here, my lord," she whispered. It was the last defense she had. "No," he agreed, and did not go. They came down the stair together that night and parted at the foot of it without a word. But a thing had changed that could not be changed back, and both of them knew it, and neither slept. If this quiet turning has moved you, stay with it to the end. For the world was not done with Adelaide, and what the season had decided about her was about to be spoken aloud in a room full of people who believed they knew her. The trouble came from London, in the person of the Earl's aunt. Lady Adeline Marchholt, widow of the old Earl's brother, arrived in the first week of December, with 2 carriages, a companion, a lady's maid, and a niece, and she arrived with a purpose. She had heard that Nathaniel had shut himself in the country and meant to pull him back into the world and settle him properly, which was to say advantageously, and she had brought with her the settling. She came into the hall shaking the rain from a mantle worth more than Adelaide's yearly wage, and cast one bright assessing look across the assembled household, and her glance stopped a half-second too long on the governess. And in that half-second, Adelaide knew she had been read and weighed and filed by a woman who made her whole living by the reading of rooms. The niece was Miss Cordelia Vane, 19 years old, fair and polished and correct, a diamond of 2 seasons who had been raised her whole life on the certainty that she was the right answer to whatever question a man of rank might ask. She curtsied to her cousin the Earl with the exact grace her governesses had drilled into her, and she took in the cold grand house that might be hers with the calm of a young woman who had never once been told no by the world, and Adelaide, watching from the edge as she always watched, felt no envy of her, only a strange, far-off pity. For the girl did not yet know she was a piece being moved. Lady Adeline saw at once what the household had not troubled to see, that the new Earl's eye went too often to the grey governess, that a fire was laid in a servant's room by his order, that something improper in its very quietness had taken root in her nephew's cold house. She did not confront it. She was far too skilled for that. She set about correcting it the way her kind corrected everything, by the steady application of social weight. "The governess," Lady Adeline said on her second evening, in the drawing-room with Adelaide standing by the door awaiting instruction and every word pitched to Carrie, "is a fixture, I am told. 20 years in the Tower with her ghosts. One does feel for these women, Nathaniel, one does, but a house cannot be run as a charity for the deranged. The Tower ought to be opened and aired and the poor creature pensioned somewhere kind. It is not healthful to keep a mad woman on the stairs." There it was, spoken in a warm room among candles and silver, the whole verdict of 20 years pronounced by a woman who had known her 2 days. Mad woman. Adelaide stood very still by the door, and felt the crowd of it, the companions' downcast eyes, Miss Vane's small, careful nothing of an expression, the servants frozen in their places. She had heard the word behind her back for 2 decades. She had never before heard it thrown across a bright room to her face. The Earl set down his glass. Miss Verlon is not deranged, aunt. She is the finest keeper of memory in this county, and I will not have her spoken of so under my roof." His voice was quiet, and it was iron. "Of course," said Lady Adeline, smiling, unbothered, filing the vehemence away as exactly the confirmation she had come to find. "How loyal you are to your servants." And she turned the talk to Miss Vane's accomplishments at the pianoforte, and Miss Vane played correctly, and the evening closed over the wound, like water over a stone. The aunt, however, had taken her reading, and she moved with speed. Within the week, she had done 3 things. She had written to the family solicitor to inquire whether a servant of unsound mind might be lawfully pensioned off against her will. She had let it be known through the servants' hall in the poisonous roundabout way such things are let known that the Tower would be opened before Christmas, whatever the governess wished. And she had arranged for the 20th of December a dinner and a small ball, the first entertainment Marchholt had seen in a generation, at which the county would meet the new earl and the suitable niece and see the house restored to its proper order. Adelaide learned of the plan for the Tower from Tom, who had it from the boot-room, who had it from the aunt's own maid, the news traveling up through the house by the underground roads that servants know. The boy found her in the north passage and told her in a rush, his face screwed up with the weight of carrying bad news to a person he had decided to love, that the grand London lady meant to have the Tower opened and cleared before Christmas Day, that she had said so to her maid as a settled thing. Adelaide thanked him and sent him back to his work with a steadiness she did not feel. Then she went into her firelit room and shut the door and stood a long while with her back against it. She went white and then very calm. She did not go to the Earl. She had lived 41 years without asking a man to save her, and she would not begin now, not even this man. Especially not this man, for to ask him would be to lay her whole naked need before him, and she could not bear that he might answer it out of pity. She had seen pity do its work on other women. Pity was the thing that let a great house keep a broken servant in a cold room and call itself kind. She would not be kept out of pity. She would rather carry Clara away into the dark alone than be the object of one soft, merciful glance from the man whose regard she had, against all her long practice, come to want. So she resolved, in the cold of her firelit room, to do the only thing left to a woman with no power but her own 2 hands. On the night of the ball, while the house was full and watching the Earl in the diamond, she would go up to the round room, and she would take from it the 3 things that mattered, the watercolors and the wooden horse and the book of pressed flowers, and she would carry them away from Marchholt herself into whatever poor lodging her savings could buy. And she would keep her vigil there instead, alone, unwatched, unmastered, until she died. Let them open an empty room. They would find no madwoman's hoard. They would find nothing at all, because she would have carried the whole of Clara away in a single bundle under her cloak. The 20th of December came cold and clear, a hard blue sky over the frost and the bare trees, and by dark the county filled the long-shut rooms of Marchholt Court. Carriages came up the gravel one after another, until the drive was a river of lamplight. There were candles in every sconce and beeswax burning where the house had known only tallow for a generation, and an orchestra of 4 in the gallery, and the great rooms that Adelaide had kept shrouded and silent came alive with silk and jewels, and the loud, bright talk of people who had come to see whether the new Earl was as grim as they had heard. The diamond stood in ice-blue silk at the head of the room beside the Earl, exactly where Lady Adeline had placed her, and Lady Adeline moved among her guests well pleased, for the house was restored to its proper use at last, and her nephew stood where she had put him, and the grey inconvenience of the governess would be swept from the Tower within the forest. And for a week. Below stairs, the servants hush, while the music came faint down the back passages. Adelaide put on her grey cloak and took up her single candle and climbed the Tower for what she believed would be the last time. Her hands were steady. She had wept all her weeping 20 years before, and had none left for this. She meant only to do the thing quickly, and be gone before the dancing ended. She had the wooden horse in her hands, and the watercolors already wrapped when she heard the step on the stair. She turned, and it was not the Earl. It was Lady Adeline, who had watched the governess slip away from the noise, and had followed on her own soft feet to catch the madwoman, at last in the very act of her madness, and behind Lady Adeline, drawn by her hiss of triumph from the gallery below, came others, Pell wringing her hands, and last of all taking the stairs 3 at a time, when he understood where the crowd was flowing. The Earl. "There," said Lady Adeline, and her voice rang in the round room for all of them to hear. "There is your keeper of memory, Nathaniel, robbing the house on the night of your ball. 20 years locked in a tower with a child's toys. And now a common thief besides. I told you she was not sound." The whole crowd looked at her. Adelaide stood in the candlelight with the wooden horse in her hands and the wrapped watercolors at her feet. 41 years old and gray and caught. And she did not weep, and she did not plead. She lifted her chin and she looked at the Earl across the small, crowded room, and she said the one true thing she had never said aloud to any of them, the sentence she could not have spoken a month before. "I am not robbing this house. I am saving the only child left in it to save." The silence that came down was total. Sephersby. And into it, before the aunt could gather her scattered triumph, the Earl crossed the round room in 3 strides, past his aunt, past the diamond, in her ice-blue silk to stand at Adelaide's side, before the whole assembled county. And he took the wooden horse gently from her hands and set it back upon the sill. "Miss Verlone keeps this room by my leave, and will keep it as long as she lives." 12 words. He said no more than that. He did not rebuke his aunt beyond the fact of standing where he stood at the governess's side, and not the diamond's. And the standing was rebuke enough. Lady Adeline's face worked. The certainty she had carried into that room, the certainty of 40 years that the order of things would arrange itself around her as it always had, fractured visibly in the candlelight, and she understood, a half-second before the rest of the room, that she had lost, and that she had lost publicly in the one arena where she had thought herself unbeatable. "Nathaniel," she began, "you cannot possibly mean it." "I mean to marry her," the Earl said, and that was 13 words she had not been prepared for at all. He turned from the room then from all of them, and looked only at Adelaide. And in front of the whole staring county, he used her given name for the first time, quietly, as though the crowd were not there at all. "Adelaide. I have kept a dead child in my coat and thought myself the only one so haunted in this house. You have kept a dead child in a tower. Let us keep them together, in the warm, and stop guarding our grief alone." He was not commanding now. There was no iron in it. "Marry me, not for the estate and not for the name, because I crossed this whole cold house to find the one person in it who understood." The diamond and ice-blue silk looked at the grey governess and the Earl who had crossed a room for her, and Miss Cordelia Vane, who had been raised her whole life to be the right answer, understood in a single clean instant that she had been asked the wrong question, and to her lasting credit, she was the first in that room to lower her eyes, seating the field, for she was young and polished, but she was not cruel, and she knew what she was seeing when she saw it. Adelaide Verlon stood in the round, cold room where a child had died in her arms 20 years before, and she looked at the man who had crossed the whole of his own house to reach her, and the 20 years of turning aside fell away from her all at once. She did not make a speech. She had never been a woman of speeches. She looked up at his face, at the grief and the warmth in it, and she reached out and closed at last the small inch that had hovered unclosed between them since the night of the first storm, and she laid her hand in his. "Yes," she said. Only that. It was enough. Lady Adeline left Marchholt 3 days later, and if she was not destroyed, she was corrected, displaced from the certainty she had ridden into the country. And in the years that followed, she spoke of the marriage as little as she could, and when pressed, allowed only that her nephew had always been willful. The solicitor's inquiry came to nothing, for there was nothing unsound in a woman who had loved a child too well to forget her. The county, which had come to see a diamond crowned, went home instead with a stranger's story, and told it, and in the telling, the mad governess of the West Tower became something else, became the woman the grieving Earl had married, and the door that had been scripture for 20 years became, at last, only a door. They were married in the small chapel at Marchholt, in the last week of the old year, quietly, with Tom the scullery boy holding the ring on a cushion, and Mrs. Hell weeping frankly into her apron, and the whole household gathered as family. For family was what they had become, and when it was done, Adelaide did not lock the West Tower any longer. She did not need to. She and Nathaniel went up together in the evenings that first married winter, and they set Edmund's miniature on the sill beside Clara's wooden horse, the two remembered children keeping each other company at last, and they let the fire be lit in the round, cold room for the first time in 20 years, and the old glass, which had known only cold, ran, warm, with the light of it. On the last evening of that first married winter, with snow falling soft and steady past the tower window she had guarded for 2 decades, Adelaide stood in the round room that was no longer cold, no longer locked, no longer only hers, and she took up the book of pressed flowers Clara had gathered a lifetime before, and she opened it. And she showed her husband the small dry blooms a dead child had pressed with her own hands, and she named them, one by one, the way the child had named them, and Nathaniel listened with his whole self, the way another child had once listened, and outside the snow came down on Marchholt Court and covered the gravel in the long grey house and the West Tower. And inside, at last, a girl named Clara was remembered by 2 people instead of 1. Thank you for staying to the end of it. If Adelaide's long vigil moved you, I hope you will carry her a little way with you, the way she carried Clara, into the warm and out of the cold.